The multiverse is a tapestry of infinite realities, each governed by its own immutable laws, its own definitions of monster and myth, its own careful boundaries between the living and the dead. Most universes maintain these boundaries with religious devotion, building walls of doctrine, silver, sunlight, and prayer to keep the darkness precisely where darkness belongs. But occasionally, in the spaces between realities where the fabric grows thin and the rules forget themselves, something tears. Not a door, not a portal, not any mechanism a scholar could diagram or a sorcerer could replicate. Just a tear, raw and ragged and completely indifferent to the consequences. And through it steps something that every universe, in its deepest and most honest mythology, has always known existed. Something that was old when the concept of old was still young. Something that finds the whole situation absolutely hilarious. The dungeons beneath the Red Keep had hosted misery for 3 centuries, and they were architecturally committed to despair, low ceilings that forced men to hunch, walls perpetually damp with condensation that smelled faintly of the river and more prominently of suffering, and a darkness so thorough that the torches didn't so much illuminate as surrender. The gold cloaks stationed in the lower cells had developed a particular professional numbness to the sounds that emerged from behind iron doors. Screaming they ignored, weeping they ignored, and the specific wet percussion of a man being encouraged toward confession also ignored. What they could not ignore, what broke through 17 years of combined dungeon experience between the two of them, was the sound of someone laughing. Not nervous laughter, not the fractured, hysterical laughter of a broken mind. This was the laughter of a man who had just heard the single funniest joke in the history of creation and couldn't decide whether to applaud or ask for an encore. "Oh," said the voice, rich and theatrical and emanating from a cell that had been empty and locked 3 minutes ago. "Oh, this is wonderful." Sir Alton, the senior guard, held his torch toward the cell door. The bars were intact. The lock was intact. The shadow beyond the bars was not behaving the way shadows were supposed to behave. It was pooling upward, defying the torch's influence entirely, assembling itself into a shape that was vaguely and then very specifically human. Tall, or broad-shouldered. Wearing what appeared to be an elaborate red coat that had absolutely no business existing in any context Sir Alton had professional framework for. "Where did you," Alton began, "fall through a hole in reality?" The shape offered helpfully, red eyes opening in the darkness like 2 coals remembering they were supposed to be on fire. "Yes, that's the accurate answer. Dimensionally speaking, I appear to have taken a wrong turn at the boundary of my universe, which, between you and me, is not something I expected to say on a Tuesday." A pause. "Is it Tuesday here? Do you have Tuesdays? You look like a civilization that would have Tuesdays." The second guard, younger, made the mistake of drawing his sword. The darkness moved. It didn't cross the distance so much as render the concept of distance temporarily irrelevant. One moment the cell was locked, and the creature was behind bars. The next moment, Sir Alton was staring at a figure standing in the corridor between them. Inside the locked cell door, outside it simultaneously for one nauseating heartbeat. And then, simply present, examining the drawn sword with the expression of a wine connoisseur presented with something interesting from an unfamiliar region. "Iron," Alucard said, tilting the blade with one finger in a way that should have cut him to the bone and visibly did not. "Not silver. Interesting. So either you lot haven't dealt with my kind before, or..." He glanced around the dungeon with genuine curiosity, taking in the architecture, the torches, the absolute medieval authenticity of everything around him. or I have landed somewhere significantly further from home than I initially estimated. His smile widened. It had too many teeth, and each one was aware of it. Either option is frankly thrilling. Sir Alton ran. This was the correct decision, and he made it with admirable speed. Sir, the younger guard stood frozen, sword still raised, performing an impressive impression of a man who had simply ceased to update his understanding of reality and was waiting for it to resolve itself. Alucard looked at him for a long moment with something that might, in a different face, have been called patience. "You should run," he said, almost kindly. "I'm going to explore your castle now, and the next person who points a sword at me is going to have a considerably less educational experience than you're currently having." He straightened his coat. It was, upon observation, an extremely red coat, the kind of red that seemed to be making a philosophical argument, and turned toward the dungeon stairs with the relaxed purposefulness of a man on a walking tour. "I'm also going to need to understand where I am, what century this is, and whether anyone in this building has the theological sophistication to have a meaningful conversation about the nature of monsters." He paused on the first step and glanced back. "Based on the architecture, I'm giving it 30% odds, but I've been surprised before." He climbed toward the light. Behind him, the younger guard slowly lowered his sword, sat down on the stone floor, and began the lengthy internal process of revising everything he thought he knew about the world. Above, in the Red Keep, Sir Alton was already screaming for the King's Guard. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The Red Keep at night was a different organism than its daylight self. During the day, it performed governance. The careful, exhausting theater of a court maintaining its grip on a continent through politics, marriage, and the credible threat of violence. At night, it became something more honest. A building full of people who wanted things from each other and were willing to conduct that wanting in darkness. Alucard moved through it with absolute ease, which was its own kind of commentary. He passed 2 Lannister guards, whose torches guttered when he walked through their light. He passed a servant carrying wine who looked up, looked directly at him, and then looked away with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that seeing things in this castle was a professional liability. He paused at a window that looked out over King's Landing. The sprawl of it, the torchlight, the smell of the city rising on the night air, salt and sewage and cooking fires, and the particular human density of 100,000 people existing in uncomfortable proximity. "Huh," he said quietly, to no one and to the city simultaneously. It was not the observation of a man unimpressed. It was the observation of a man recalibrating, taking in the scope of a new world and then running the initial calculations of what it contained, what it lacked, and what it might, under the right circumstances, provide. He had been in new situations before. He had worn the shape of a stranger in strange lands with the comfortable familiarity of a coat he'd owned for centuries. But this was different in a way his considerable intelligence was already categorizing with interest. No cursed energy, no alchemy, no ki or chakra or any of the other flavors of structured supernatural power he'd encountered in the deep architecture of reality. What this world had instead was older and stranger. A magic that didn't announce itself, that lived in fire and prophecy and the spaces between life and death, where something with a capital letter and a lord was paying attention. That, Alucard thought, following a torchlit corridor toward the sound of raised voices and the smell of spilled wine, was going to be very interesting indeed. The small council chamber had seen its share of crises. It had weathered the Mad King's increasingly creative definitions of governance, survived the Baratheon succession with its attendant complications, processed the stark unpleasantness with professional efficiency, and continued functioning through the particular administrative challenge of being technically controlled by a woman whose son wore the crown, but whose hands held everything the crown touched. Our Cersei Lannister had not survived this long by being slow. When Sir Alton arrived at her chambers at the 3rd hour past midnight, bleeding from a gash on his forehead he couldn't fully account for, and using words like shadow and red eyes. And "It walked through the locked door, Your Grace. It walked through it like the door was a suggestion." She was already sitting up, already composed, already thinking. By the time the Kingsguard reported that 3 additional guards had encountered the intruder on the upper corridors. 2 incapacitated, 1 technically unharmed, but sitting against a wall reciting a prayer to the 7, with the rhythmic desperation of a man bailing water from a sinking ship. Cersei had assembled the relevant information into a working theory. Something had gotten into the Red Keep. It was not human. It was not afraid of the Kingsguard. It was currently, according to the last reported sighting, standing in the map room examining the painted table with what witnesses described as academic interest. She went herself. This was not the decision her advisors recommended. It was absolutely the correct decision. Alucard was, in fact, examining the painted table, running one gloved finger along the coastline of the continent with the focused attention of a cartographer finding errors in someone else's work. Then he had helped himself to a flagon of wine from the sideboard, which he was holding with every appearance of genuine appreciation. The Kingsguard, 4 of them, the best in the castle, armed with Valyrian steel and professional menace, were arranged in a formation that communicated absolute threat, and were having absolutely no visible effect on the figure at the table, who had not acknowledged their presence beyond a single glance when they'd entered in a small sound that might have been amusement. Cersei walked through the Kingsguard formation without breaking stride and stopped at the opposite side of the table. Alucard looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. This was unusual for Cersei, who deployed silence as a weapon with surgical precision, and unprecedented for Alucard, who deployed everything as a performance. But something about the encounter produced a pause that both of them seemed to find, in their separate ways, worthwhile. "You're not afraid," he said first. It was not quite an accusation. It was closer to an observation delivered with genuine curiosity, the way a naturalist might note an unexpected behavior in a specimen. "Fear is a luxury," Cersei said. "I find information more useful." "What are you?" Alucard's smile arrived the way weather arrives, gradually and then all at once. "Now that is the right question. Most people start with who. Who tells you almost nothing useful. What?" He set the wine flagon down and spread his hands in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously theatrical and precise. "What gets to the actual substance of the matter?" He tilted his head. "I'm what your myths are afraid to name correctly. The thing your priests assure you doesn't exist because the alternative is too inconvenient for organized religion. A vampire," Cersei said. The smile flickered, not with displeasure, with something closer to delight at being interrupted by someone who skipped to the answer. "You have the concept. We have the stories." She studied him with the flat, evaluating attention she normally reserved for political opponents. She was deciding whether to destroy or utilize. "The stories say you can be killed. Sunlight, beheading, fire. The stories," Alucard said pleasantly, are doing their best with limited information. He picked up the wine again. "I've been beheaded. I've been set on fire. I've been staked, drowned, dismembered, shot with weapons that would sterilize a continent, and on one memorable occasion launched into orbit. I'm still here, and frankly, I'm starting to think the universe is trying to tell me something. He took a drink and looked at the flagon with appreciation. This is genuinely excellent, by the way. Whatever else your civilization has gotten wrong, and preliminary evidence suggests quite a lot. The wine is doing serious work. Cersei was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant she was making a decision, not experiencing uncertainty. "I have enemies," she said. "Of course you do," Alucard agreed. Powerful woman in a medieval patriarchy maintaining control through superior intelligence, while everyone around her conspires to limit or eliminate her. The enemies are practically load-bearing architecture at this point. Remove them, and the whole situation collapses. He looked at her with those red eyes that had no business being as perceptive as they were. "You're thinking about whether I can be pointed at something. Whether something unkillable and not particularly attached to the laws of gods or men might solve a problem that more conventional instruments haven't managed. Can you be?" The question landed in the room with more weight than its brevity suggested. This was Cersei Lannister's actual skill, not cruelty, not beauty, not even intelligence, though she possessed all three in abundance. Her actual skill was identifying the exact fulcrum of a situation and applying pressure there with perfect timing. Alucard set the wine down again. His expression shifted into something more genuine and therefore considerably more dangerous. The look of a man setting aside performance and speaking from whatever passed for his actual self. "I've had one master in 5 centuries, he said. "One. And she earned that position in a way I suspect would not translate to your particular political context." He let that settle. "I don't take orders. I don't do contracts. I don't get pointed at things by people who think they can manage what I am because they've managed difficult things before." A pause, precise as a scalpel. "What I do is find situations that interest me and remain in them until they stop being interesting. Your world." He glanced at the painted table, and the map of a continent he didn't recognize, full of names that meant nothing to him yet, "has the preliminary indicators of something interesting. So I'm going to stay for a while." Cersei held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then, "And if I order you removed?" The shadows in the room did something. They didn't move exactly. Movement implied starting position and ending position, and the shadows declined to commit to either. They simply became more present, fuller, and as if they'd been waiting for an excuse to stop pretending they were ordinary darkness. The 4 Kingsguard took an involuntary step backward in perfect unison. Alucard didn't move at all. "Your Grace," he said with a courtesy so elaborate it looped back around to threat. "I walked through a locked door in your dungeon, incapacitated 6 of your guards without killing any of them. Yet, because I'm in a generous mood and this is a first impression. And I am currently standing in the most secure room in your castle, having a conversation that no one authorized." His smile returned, all teeth and no warmth, and somehow, inexplicably, a trace of genuine appreciation. "The removal has already failed. We're now in the negotiation phase, whether you've decided to acknowledge it yet or not." Silence. Then Cersei Lannister, Queen Regent of the 7 Kingdoms. He made the same calculation she had made 100 times with 100 dangerous men. The calculation of whether a force could be directed rather than destroyed. And arrived, for the first time in her considerable political career, at an answer she wasn't certain she trusted. "You said you find interesting situations," she said carefully. "I did. There's a war coming. Several, actually. They tend to stack in this part of the world. "I noticed the map," Alucard said. 7 kingdoms, one throne, approximately 9 different parties with serious claims or serious armies. And something. He glanced north, in the direction of a wall he hadn't seen yet, but could feel in the way very old things feel. Other very old things across distance. Something up there that none of your political calculations have adequately accounted for. Cersei's composure flickered. Just slightly. Just enough. "Stay, then," she said. Not an order, not quite an invitation. And something in between that preserved enough dignity to be functional. "See what interests you." Alucard raised the wine flagon in a small salute. "Your Grace," he said. "I thought you'd never ask." He left King's Landing on the 3rd day because the city, for all its density of human misery and political intrigue, was beginning to feel like a waiting room. Alucard had spent centuries in waiting rooms of various architectural descriptions and had developed a finely calibrated sensitivity to the sensation. That particular quality of anticipation where everything interesting was happening somewhere else, and the current location was merely the administrative preamble to actual events. Our Cersei had attempted twice more to establish parameters, boundaries, a working relationship with defined roles and mutual obligations. Both attempts had been met with the same pleasant, immovable deflection. And on the second occasion, he had simply been gone when she finished speaking, which had reportedly caused her to throw a wine goblet at the wall, with enough force to dent the plaster. He found this flattering. The Riverlands received him the way the Riverlands received most things. With exhausted suspicion and the specific wariness of a region that had been fought over so many times, it had stopped bothering to repair the fences between conflicts. The villages he passed through in the gray autumn light had the hollow quality of places where the population had learned to disappear when strangers appeared on the road. Smart, he thought. Correctly calibrated to current circumstances, and he walked the King's Road north without urgency, reading the landscape the way he'd learned to read every new environment, not for threats, since threats were not a category that meaningfully applied to him, but for texture, the specific flavor of a world suffering, the particular vintage of its despair. This world's despair was excellent. Complex, layered, aged in the oak of several generations of cyclical violence and structural injustice. He was not enjoying it in any way that implied approval of the underlying causes. He was appreciating it the way a geologist appreciates a particularly expressive rock formation, as evidence of enormous forces operating over enormous time. He smelled the Brotherhood before he saw them. Not their bodies, though a company of men who lived rough in the Riverlands had a fairly specific olfactory signature. And what he smelled was older and stranger. The particular scent of fire that had been used for something other than warmth. Purposeful fire. Fire with theology behind it. He had encountered religious power in various configurations across his long existence, had been burned by it and sustained by it and annoyed by it in roughly equal measure. And the fire of R'hllor had a quality he hadn't encountered before. Not holy in the way Integra's world understood holy, and not the cold silver certainty of the Church's disapproval. This was older, more honest about what fire actually was, more comfortable with the idea that light and darkness were not opposites, but collaborators in a very long project. He found them in a burned mill. There were perhaps 20 of them, scarred, road-worn, wearing the kind of righteousness that comes not from doctrine, but from surviving things that should have killed you. At their center, crouched by a fire, was a man whose face told an unusual story. Not unusual in the way faces are unusual when they're striking or strange. Unusual in the way a face is unusual when it has died multiple times and bears the accumulated evidence of each occasion. the faint silver tracery of wounds that had been healed by something other than medicine. The eyes of someone who had been to the other side of death, often enough to have developed an opinion about the decor. Beric Targaryen looked up as Alucard walked through the mill's broken doorway and did not reach for his sword. This was either extraordinary composure or extraordinary perception. Alucard, who had made a long study of the difference, suspected it was the latter. "You're not a man," Beric said. Not an accusation, a classification. "Technically accurate," Alucard agreed, examining the mill's interior with the relaxed attention he brought to all new spaces. The Brotherhood had arranged themselves with the unconscious tactical discipline of people who'd been ambushed enough times that readiness had become reflexive. Hands near weapons, weight forward, eyes tracking. Thoros of Myr stood to Beric's left, and his reaction was the one Alucard found most interesting. The Red Priest was afraid, but it was a specific fear. The fear of a man who has dealt in supernatural fire long enough to recognize when something supernatural is looking back at him, and the recognition was doing something complicated behind his eyes. "What are you?" Thoros asked. His accent placed him somewhere east, and his hands were very still in the deliberate way of hands that wanted to be doing something and were being prevented by intelligence. "I get that question a lot," Alucard said. "The answer has layers." He looked at the fire between them. The Brotherhood's campfire, ordinary wood and ordinary flame. But Thoros had been tending it, and it had that purposeful quality around its edges, that sense of fire that knew it was being watched by something that cared about it. "You use R'hllor's fire. That's..." He tilted his head. "Actually interesting. Not in a threatening way. In a genuinely, intellectually interesting way." "The Lord of Light," Thoros began. "Burns things," Alucard said. "Yes, I'm familiar with the general brief. Light burns darkness, fire cleanses corruption, and the night is dark and full of terrors, etc." He paused. "I'm one of the terrors, just so we're establishing context clearly. But your fire..." He looked at it again, with those red eyes that saw more than light. "Your fire does something else. It reverses something." The Brotherhood had gone very still. Beric Targaryen stood slowly, with the careful movement of a man whose body had been repaired so many times that he'd learned to treat it with a certain mechanical respect. He was, Alucard registered with genuine attention, a man in an unusual condition. Not undead in any category Alucard had a file for. Not alive in the way living things were alive. Something in between, sustained by something external, burning on borrowed fuel, every breath a small theological argument. "You've died," Alucard said. "6 times," Beric said. Alucard was quiet for a moment. This was not a common occurrence. "I've died..." He considered the number with the genuine difficulty of someone who had lost count. "The mathematics get complicated. The point is that I came back from all of them. But the mechanism was different." He looked at Beric with something that was not quite respect and not quite recognition, but occupied the territory between them. "What brings you back?" "The Lord of Light's will," Thoros said, with the conviction of a man who had performed the miracle enough times to have stopped questioning it and started just being grateful. "And what does the Lord of Light want with a dead man?" Alucard asked, directing the question at Beric rather than the priest, because the priest would give him doctrine, and the man would give him truth. Beric considered this with the deliberateness of someone who has had the question longer than they've had an answer. "Justice," he said finally, "for the small folk, for the people the great lords use and abandon." He paused. It doesn't feel like a grand purpose most days. It feels like the only thing left. Alucard looked at him for a long time. Around them, the Brotherhood waited, hands still near weapons, watching the exchange with the particular anxiety of men watching two forces interact, whose rules they only partially understood. Thoros was the most anxious. The Red Priest could feel something in the vampire's presence that his theology hadn't prepared him for. A wrongness that wasn't evil exactly, but was deeply, fundamentally outside R'hllor's jurisdiction. And that jurisdictional ambiguity was doing nothing good for his professional confidence. Then, Alucard did something none of the Brotherhood anticipated. He sat down. Not collapsed, not fell. Sat, with deliberate ease, across the fire from Beric Dondarrion, and in the manner of a man settling in for a conversation he expected to find worthwhile. He looked into the R'hllor fire with those red eyes, and the fire, remarkably, looked back, not aggressively, not with the instinctive hostility of holy light encountering genuine darkness, but with the complicated recognition of one very old force acknowledging another. "I've been alive for over 500 years," Alucard said, to the fire as much as to Beric. In that time, I have met approximately 3 people I found genuinely interesting. You might be the 4th. He looked up at Dondarrion. A man who keeps dying in service of an idea he's not even sure he believes in anymore. Sustained by a god whose motives he stopped trying to understand, finding meaning in the gap between what he was and what he's become. A pause. That's not a small thing. Most people who lose that much of themselves just... He gestured on a small motion that somehow conveyed enormous distances. Stop. Some days I think about stopping, Beric said quietly. I know, Alucard said. That's what makes you interesting. Thoros of Myr lowered his hand from his belt very slowly, the specific movement of a man deciding not to do something he'd been considering. The fire between the vampire and the dead man burned with a quality that was neither comfortable nor threatening. Something stranger, something that felt, to the watching Brotherhood, like a conversation happening at a frequency just below their ability to hear. Outside, the Riverland's wind moved through the broken mill, carrying the smell of coming rain and distant burning and the particular autumn exhaustion of a land that had been at war too long. Inside, the most dangerous thing in the known world and the most frequently dead man in the Riverlands sat across a fire and found, in each other, something neither had expected to find anywhere. The company. The rain came down on the Riverlands with the committed thoroughness of weather that had somewhere to be and was passing through on principle. The Brotherhood had made what peace they could with the mill's broken roof. Oilskins and repositioned bedrolls, and the stoic acceptance of men who had stopped distinguishing between comfortable and uncomfortable several campaigns ago. Alucard didn't need shelter from rain, and found the whole performance of seeking it mildly anthropologically interesting. He sat where he had been sitting, letting the water fall through him in the gaps between being entirely solid, which he was doing partly because it was practical and partly because the expression on the face of the Brotherhood member who first noticed it was genuinely priceless. Beric sat across from him through the night while his men slept in shifts, and the fire had been moved under the most intact section of roof and burned with the steady purposefulness of fire that knew it was being relied upon. Thoros had eventually slept. The Red Priest had the ability to fall unconscious with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who had learned that theology could wait, but the body couldn't. And his snoring provided a low rhythmic counterpoint to the rain. "Tell me about the thing beyond the wall," Alucard said, somewhere in the 3rd hour past midnight. Beric looked at him across the fire. "What do you know about it already?" "I know it's old," Alucard said. I felt it before I left King's Landing. Not specifically, not a shape or a name. Just the sense of something that has been present in this world long enough to have become part of its fundamental temperature. He considered. The way I feel things that have been dead long enough. There's a particular quality to ancient death. It stops being about the individual thing that died and starts being about the concept. The White Walkers, Beric said. The name carried weight in his mouth. Not the weight of superstition, but the weight of a man who had spoken to survivors. The Night King, the army of the dead. He looked into the fire. Most people in the South think it's a legend, old Nan's stories. Something to frighten children. Most people in most places think the things that are actually going to kill them are legends, Alucard said. It's one of the more consistent features of human civilization. Remarkable, really. You'd think the track record would produce more humility. You don't think it's a legend. I think something up there is doing something to death that death doesn't usually permit, Alucard said. Raising the dead is not, in my experience, a simple matter. The mechanisms involved are specific, theological mostly. They require a relationship with whatever manages the boundary between living and dead in a given universe. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. Not concern exactly, but the specific attention of a specialist encountering a problem in his field. Whatever is beyond your wall has a claim on death. Not a trick, not a borrowed power, an actual jurisdictional claim. That's... He turned the word over, or unusual. Can it claim you? Beric asked. The question was direct in the way that Beric's questions tended to be direct, stripped of the social padding that most people wrapped around difficult subjects. It was, Alucard had decided over the course of the night, one of the man's most functional qualities. Death had burned away his patience for indirection. Alucard was quiet for longer than he usually permitted himself to be quiet. The rain intensified briefly, drumming on the oilskins, and then relented into something steadier. I don't know, he said finally. This was, in the entire span of his existence, one of perhaps a dozen genuine admissions of uncertainty he had made to another person. He made it now, with the careful deliberateness of someone placing an unexploded shell on a table, gently, with full awareness of what it was. The power that made me is specific to my universe, he continued. The mechanics of my existence, what sustains me, what governs my relationship with death, those are written in rules that belong to a different reality than this one. Whether the Night King's claim on death is universal or local. He gestured at the rain, the world, the fundamental question of whether the rules he'd been built under still fully applied here. I genuinely cannot tell you. And I find that interesting, Beric offered, with the ghost of something that had once been a smile. I was going to say concerning, Alucard said. But yes, also that. Beric looked at him steadily. You're afraid of it. I'm interested in it, Alucard said, with a precision that was itself a kind of answer. The distinction matters. Fear is what you feel when something threatens you. Interest is what you feel when something might actually be capable of threatening you, which is a different and considerably rarer condition. He looked north through the mill's broken wall, I through the rain and the darkness and the hundreds of miles of war-exhausted continent between them and the wall. In 5 centuries, I have encountered perhaps 4 things that produce genuine interest rather than boredom. Your friend with his borrowed lives is one of them. Whatever is organizing the dead beyond your wall is another. Beric absorbed this with the composure of a man who had stopped being surprised by difficult information, but hadn't stopped taking it seriously. The Brotherhood is going north, he said. Not immediately. We have obligations here first. People who need what protection we can give them. He paused, but eventually. The Night King is everyone's problem, whether the great lords have admitted it yet or not. They haven't, Alucard said. I've seen their map room. Their entire strategic consciousness is pointed at each other. The White Walkers occupy approximately the same mental real estate as bad weather, acknowledged in principle, as planned for not at all. Would you come north with us? Beric asked. It was a remarkable question for its directness and for its implicit acknowledgement. Not a command, not a request for service, not an attempt to utilize or direct. A genuine question from one impossible thing to another, about whether their paths might run the same direction for a while. Alucard looked at him. Ask me again in the morning, he said. I want to see how your priest reacts to me in daylight before I commit to extended company. The ghost of a smile crossed Beric's face again, more substantial this time. Thoros has seen stranger things than you. He hasn't, Alucard said pleasantly. But I appreciate the hospitality of the claim. Dawn came gray and waterlogged over the riverlands, leaking through the mill's broken sections with the apologetic quality of light that knew it wasn't improving the situation. The Brotherhood woke in stages. The practiced efficiency of soldiers who had learned to be functional before they were comfortable. Thoros emerged from his oilskin with the specific expression of a man whose relationship with R'hllor's morning blessing was complicated by a vampire sitting 6 feet away, looking entirely too alert for something that technically should not be awake at any hour. You're still here, Thoros said. Observant, Alucard said. And your god choose you for your perceptive qualities? Thoros sat up and looked at him with the assessing attention of a priest who was performing a theological inventory in real time, trying to categorize, trying to find the framework that explained what he was looking at, running through the available doctrine and finding the relevant chapter conspicuously absent. What are you to R'hllor? Thoros asked finally. Not hostility. Genuine professional uncertainty. Alucard considered this with more seriousness than he brought to most questions. What am I to your Lord of Light? He repeated slowly. That is actually a good question. He looked at the fire, which was burning lower now in the morning, but still carrying that purposeful quality, still bearing the trace of Thoros's prayers from the night before. In my world, I have a complicated relationship with God. Capital G, Christian framework, the whole apparatus. And what I am was, according to the relevant theological authorities, a crime against that God's natural order. An abomination. The darkness that holy light is supposed to burn away. He paused. Your fire looked at me last night and didn't do any of that. Which means either your Lord of Light has a different opinion about what I am, or... He looked at Thoros directly. His jurisdiction doesn't fully extend to things that come from outside his universe. Thoros was very quiet. That second option, he said carefully, is either very good news or very bad news, depending on what you intend to do here. I haven't decided yet, Alucard said, keeping my options open. He stood, adjusting his coat with the casual attention of a man beginning his day. Your leader wants to go north eventually. I find the north interesting. These things may or may not result in shared travel arrangements. He looked around at the Brotherhood. 20 men watching him with expressions distributed evenly between wariness and the reluctant fascination of people who had decided that if something unkillable was going to be in their vicinity, it was better to watch it carefully than look away. In the meantime, you mentioned obligations here. People who need protection. Something shifted in his expression, subtle and genuine. I find that I have some time. The Brotherhood exchanged looks. Beric Dondarrion, who had died 6 times in service of an idea and kept coming back because the idea refused to let him go, looked at the vampire who had fallen through a hole in reality and decided to stay because things were interesting, and made a decision with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned to trust the strange convergences that Rahalor's fire sometimes produced. "There's a village," he said. 2 hours east. Aunt Lannister garrison has been taking their food stores. Alucard smiled, all teeth, all awareness. "Lead the way," he said. The faceless men did not panic. This was foundational to their identity. The removal of self included the removal of all the inconvenient emotional responses that self tended to generate, and panic was near the top of that list. What they experienced instead, when the contract arrived through the usual channels with the usual discretion, was something closer to professional interest, shaded with the specific variety of unease that arises when a problem doesn't fit the available methodology. The contract had originated in King's Landing. The patron was anonymous in the way that only people with very specific resources could achieve anonymity. Not the rough anonymity of a poor man with no name, but the precise, expensive anonymity of someone who understood how the faceless men operated and had structured their approach accordingly. The target description was unusual, not in the sense of being vague. It was in fact remarkably specific, detailing physical appearance, Oz last known location, behavioral patterns, and one critical notation that the senior acolyte who processed the intake had read 3 times before passing it up the hierarchy. The target does not die by conventional means. Previous attempts, 6 gold cloaks, 4 Kingsguard, have produced 0 fatalities in the target and considerable psychological damage in the attempting parties. Client requests innovative methodology. The many-faced god collected deaths, and this was the fundamental theology. All deaths belong to him, and the faceless men were his instruments, redirecting the deaths that the living tried to avoid or delay toward their proper destinations. The many-faced god did not, in the accumulated doctrine of the House of Black and White, have a formal position on things that could not be given to him. This was a gap in the theology that the senior acolytes preferred not to examine too closely. They sent 2. The first arrived in the Riverlands, ahead of the second, wearing the face of a traveling merchant with the tired legitimacy of a man 3 weeks from a comfortable bed. He found the Brotherhood's trail without difficulty. 20 men moving through the Riverlands left traces for someone trained to read them, and the additional trace of something that moved with them, but left a different kind of impression on the world, was, to his trained perception, almost luminous in its distinctiveness, not a footprint exactly. More like the absence of certain things that should be present wherever living things walked. The small disruptions that breath and body heat and the nervous energy of alive things produced in the environment around them. The vampire left none of these. What it left instead was harder to describe, a kind of negative space, a place where the world's natural assumption of life had been interrupted and hadn't fully recovered. He followed this trace to a village 2 hours east of the burned mill and arrived to find the village in a state of surprised relief. The Lannister garrison, 12 men, previously in the process of conducting what they'd classified internally as tax collection, and what the village classified as everything they needed to survive the winter, had been relieved of their function. They were alive, which was not what he'd expected given the target's profile, nurse, but they were occupying various states of structural damage that suggested the intervention had not been gentle. 3 had broken sword arms, Two had encountered something in the granary that had left them sitting against the wall with expressions calibrated somewhere between shock and religious conversion. The garrison commander had been hung carefully by his belt from the village's gate, high enough to be visible and low enough to be recovered without ladders. He was conscious and uninjured, and absolutely unwilling to describe what had done it. The village itself was in the process of celebrating with the specific manic relief of people who had been certain they were going to starve and had abruptly been informed otherwise. The Brotherhood moved among them with the practiced ease of people accustomed to this kind of aftermath. And their leader, the repeatedly dead man with the lightning sword, was speaking with the village elder with the quiet attentiveness of someone for whom helping people had stopped being a moral position and become simply what he did. The merchant-faced, faceless man stood at the village's edge and watched and built his assessment. The target was not present. The target's traces were everywhere. That negative space, that interrupted assumption of life, distributed through the village in the pattern of something that had moved quickly and with complete disregard for the resistance it had encountered. He followed the traces to the granary and found, chalked on the inside of the door in handwriting that was either very confident or completely indifferent to legibility, a single sentence. Already knew you were following me. Catch up when you're ready. He stood in the granary doorway for a long moment. Then he went to find his colleague. They met at a crossroads 2 miles north of the village, by which point Alucard had apparently decided that the theatrical potential of the situation was too good to waste, and was sitting on a milestone with the relaxed posture of a man who had been waiting for a specific appointment. The second faceless man, currently wearing the face of a young woman, which was either an operational choice or a statement, stood beside the first, and both of them regarded the vampire with the professional composure of people who had looked at dangerous things long enough to have developed a genuine methodology for it. Alucard looked back at them with those red eyes and the expression of a man at a restaurant who has been brought exactly what he ordered. "Faceless men," he said. "I've been wondering when you'd show up. Someone in King's Landing, and I have a suspicion about who. Though I'll admit the paranoid political landscape of this continent makes attribution genuinely difficult. Decided that if the Kingsguard couldn't manage me, escalating to the professionals was the logical next step." He tilted his head. "I find this flattering. The Kingsguard was embarrassing. You at least represent a serious institutional commitment to the problem." Neither faceless man spoke. This was technique, silence as pressure, or the absence of response as a tool for producing revelation in targets who needed to fill the quiet. "That doesn't work on me," Alucard said. "I've been alone with my thoughts for 5 centuries. Silence is where I live." He swung his legs idly against the milestone. "Let's talk about your theology, because I find it genuinely interesting, and also because it has direct bearing on what happens next. The many-faced God collects deaths, all deaths. The gift of death as mercy, as inevitability, as the fundamental endpoint that everything alive is moving toward." He paused. What does he do with things that don't move toward that endpoint? Things that are already dead and have declined to complete the journey? The faceless man wearing the merchant's face said carefully, "All men must die." "Yes," Alucard agreed. "Profoundly, boringly true for the category of things you normally work with." He stood from the milestone with a fluid ease that was either grace or the absence of the muscular effort that grace normally required. "I am not a man. I haven't been for a very long time. And the death that your God collects?" He looked at them with an attention that was suddenly and completely serious beneath the theatrical surface. "Is not something I carry anymore. I gave everything I had to give in that direction 500 years ago. The many-faced god received his payment from me before your house was built. He spread his hands. So, methodological problem. I don't have a death to offer him. I can't be given to him, which means this contract is... He appeared to search for the precise term, theologically insolvent. The second faceless man, the one wearing the young woman's face, moved. It was fast, genuinely fast. The specific speed of a body trained from childhood to the absolute limit of human physical capacity, with techniques layered on techniques until movement became something closer to intention than mechanics. The blade was Valyrian steel, which was the most serious material this world had to offer for the purpose of ending things. And the strike was aimed at the junction of neck and spine, with the precision of someone who had made that strike successfully on a considerable number of occasions. It passed through Alucard like light through water, not deflected, not blocked. Through, his body simply declined to be where the blade was, redistributing itself around the steel with the casual indifference of smoke around a hand, and then redistributing back with a completeness that left him entirely unharmed, and the faceless man standing in the exact position of someone whose most reliable technique had just been politely refused by physics. Valyrian steel, Alucard said, looking at the blade with genuine appreciation. Remarkable material. I can feel why it's special here. It has a quality, a kind of intentionality in its forging, like the metal was convinced to want to cut things. Almost supernatural. He looked at the faceless man. Still not sufficient. But I genuinely respect the escalation. The shadows came then. Not dramatically, not the grand theatrical deployment he used for effect. This was functional, in the shadows moving the way water moves when a drain opens, following the available geometry toward a specific purpose. They surrounded both faceless men not with violence, but with presence. The unmistakable communication of a force demonstrating its scale without applying it. Here is what I propose, Alucard said, his voice carrying a quality it hadn't had during the earlier conversation. Something older was something that remembered exactly how many people it had consumed and what their last moments had contributed to its understanding of death. You go back to your house. You tell whoever maintains the theological records that you encountered something outside the standard categories. Something that arrived from outside this universe's jurisdiction and therefore falls into whatever doctrinal gap your many-faced god has for things he doesn't own. He looked at them steadily. And you tell the person who issued this contract, with my compliments, that the next time they want to point something at me, they should come themselves. I find middlemen inefficient. The shadows withdrew. The crossroads was quiet. The faceless man wearing the merchant's face looked at his colleague. His colleague looked back, and an entire professional assessment passed between them in the space of 2 seconds. The assessment of people who dealt in certainties and had encountered something that their certainties had no purchase on. The contract cannot be fulfilled, the merchant-faced man said finally. The admission had the quality of a theological statement, something being entered into a record. Correct, Alucard said pleasantly. The many-faced god can have a conversation with me directly, Alucard said. If he has opinions about my existence, I'm very open to theological debate. I find it clarifying. He turned north on the Crossroads Road, dismissing them with the completeness of someone who had closed a topic. Safe travels. Your house is genuinely impressive. In another context, I would find this interesting for much longer. He paused without turning. The woman who issued the contract. She'll try something else. Tell her I said. A small pause, the pause of someone selecting a message with care. That I don't hold grudges, but I do keep track. He walked north. Behind him, the two finest instruments of the many-faced god stood at a crossroads in the Riverland's reign and did something they were almost never required to do. They returned empty-handed. The wall was exactly what it was supposed to be, and nothing like what he'd expected, which was an unusual combination. He had expected impressive. 700 feet of ancient ice rising from the landscape, with the blunt authority of something built by people who understood that scale was its own argument. He had not expected alive. Not alive in the biological sense, and not alive in the way the forests south of it were alive with the ordinary industry of things growing and dying and growing again. Alive in the way very old constructed things sometimes became alive. Saturated with the intention of their makers over such a long span of time that the intention had become structural, load-bearing, part of the fundamental physics of the object. The wall had been built to keep something out. It had been performing that function for 8,000 years. The performance had become the thing itself. He stood at its base for a long time. The Night's Watch brother who challenged him lasted approximately 4 seconds before the specific quality of Alucard's attention convinced him that whatever his standing orders specified about unauthorized approach, this situation had evolved beyond the framework those orders were designed to address. Alucard left him alive and unharmed, which was becoming something of a pattern, and climbed, not the elevator, the ice itself, moving up the wall's face with the patient verticality of something that didn't need to breathe and didn't register cold and wasn't troubled by the 700-foot drop below him with any of the biological urgency that made drops significant to things that could be damaged by falling. He climbed because the wall deserved to be climbed directly, because the physical contact with 8,000 years of intention told him things about this world's relationship with death that no conversation could have provided. The wall remembered the long night, not in words, not in images, in the specific material memory of ice that had been present when something terrible had come out of the north, and the only answer available had been to put a barrier between the terrible thing and everything that wanted to survive it. He pressed his palm flat against the ice near the top and felt the memory move through him like cold that was older than temperature. The accumulated terror of a civilization reduced to this single act of desperate architecture. The hope compressed into every stone and every spell and every year of maintenance by men who mostly died before they understood what they were maintaining. He said quietly, to the wall and to the memory and to the thing he could feel on the other side of it with increasing clarity, now that he was high enough to be past most of the magical interference the structure generated. He pulled himself over the top and stood on the wall's edge, looking north. The landscape below was white and gray and enormous, the true north stretching to a horizon that felt further away than horizons should, as if the land itself was expanding to match the scale of what occupied it. The haunted forest spread below him in the middle distance, the trees standing with the specific stillness of trees that had stopped responding to wind because the things moving among them were more significant than weather. And beyond the forest, in the deep distance where the land rose toward something that wasn't quite mountains and wasn't quite weather and wasn't quite either, something was present in a way that presence normally wasn't. He felt it the way he felt all ancient things, as a weight in the part of his consciousness that had been, for 500 years, the deepest and most honest part. The part that remembered being human not with nostalgia, but with the clinical accuracy of something that had examined that memory from sufficient distance to understand it clearly. This weight was different from anything he had felt in his own universe. Different from the divine machinery of the Christian God, different from the structured supernatural of every other power he'd encountered. This was something that had been here before the wall, before the civilizations that built it, before the concept of civilization itself. Something that was native to this world in the way that cold was native to winter, not imposed on it, but of it. He went north. The cold was not a problem. The distance was not a problem. The things moving in the haunted forest, whites, dozens of them, Makath the Dead repurposed with the specific efficiency of an army that didn't need to be fed or rested or kept alive, noticed him and moved toward him with the mechanical certainty of things responding to an instruction, and then stopped. This was interesting. He stood in a clearing while the whites surrounded him in a rough perimeter and did not attack, their dead eyes tracking him with the empty attention of cameras rather than combatants. Ison understood that he was being looked at by something that was using them as instruments of perception. The Night King was somewhere in the distance, as cold and present as the landscape itself. And the Night King was looking at him through the white's dead eyes and performing his own assessment. Alucard looked back. "Hello," he said, to the whites and through them to whatever was directing them. "I'd offer to shake hands, but I don't know your customs. And one of us is running well below normal body temperature, even for the undead demographics, so..." He looked around at the perimeter of dead faces. "I'm going to make an educated guess that you don't talk, in the conventional sense, which means this is either going to be a very short conversation or a very unconventional one, depending on how flexible your communication methodology is." The whites were still. The cold deepened, not the ambient cold of a winter landscape. A directed cold, intentional, the temperature dropping with the specific quality of a force being applied rather than a condition being experienced. It moved toward him and met his presence the way the Arhalar fire had met it at the Brotherhood's camp, not with the automatic hostility of opposition, but with the more complicated response of one ancient force encountering another and taking a moment to categorize. The cold moved through him, or tried to. What it found inside him was not warmth. Alucard had not been warm in any biological sense for 5 centuries. But something else, something the Night King's cold had no framework for. The souls he carried. Not metaphorically, the literal accumulated consciousness of every person he had consumed over 500 years. The army of the dead that lived inside his own existence. Millions of them. Each one a complete human life compressed into the gestalt of what he was. The Night King's cold moved through him and found an interior that was already occupied by something vast and dead and utterly unlike anything in this world's experience of death. The cold withdrew. The whites took one collective step backward. Alucard felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The specific sensation of being genuinely, completely surprised. "Oh," he said softly. The Night King could raise the dead. This world's dead. The dead that belonged to this universe's jurisdiction, the souls that the laws of this reality governed. What lived inside Alucard was not this world's dead. It was the dead of another universe entirely. Souls claimed under different laws, sustained by different rules, answering to a different fundamental authority than anything the Night King had ever encountered. When the Night King's power had moved through him looking for purchase, it had found millions of dead that it could not touch, could not claim, could not raise, could not incorporate, a vast interior space of death that simply and completely did not belong to him. The Night King had encountered something he could not recruit. The whites held their perimeter without advancing, and the cold continued its directed presence without penetrating. And the ancient intelligence behind both of them processed this information with the patience of something that had been thinking at geological speed for 10,000 years. Alucard, for his part, was having a feeling he hadn't had in so long that it took him almost a full minute to identify it correctly. He was impressed, not by power. He had encountered power sufficient to destroy continents and found it boring. Not by age. He had felt things older than the Night King and cataloged them without particular excitement. He was impressed by the architecture of what the Night King was, the pure, elegant, and terrible simplicity of it, a force that had taken the most universal truth available, the fact that everything died and built a civilization on that truth, not a corruption of death, not a theft of death, a philosophy of death enacted at scale, patient as ice, inevitable as winter. "You're not trying to live forever," Alucard said slowly, working it out as he spoke, to the whites and through them to the cold intelligence beyond. "You're not afraid of death. You are death, like this world's version of it, the end that the entire cycle has been building toward." A pause. "You're not the villain of this story. You're the conclusion." The cold was very present. "Well," Alucard said, and his voice had something in it that had not been there since he'd fallen through the dimensional rift into the Red Keep's dungeons. A quality that was not quite solemnity and not quite excitement, but occupied the exact space between them where genuinely significant things happened. This just became considerably more interesting than I anticipated. Above him, the stars of a world he didn't come from burned cold and clear. And somewhere in the vast white north, the Night King looked at the thing that had walked into his domain, carrying its own army of unreachable dead. And something that had not varied in 10,000 years varied, almost imperceptibly. The long night, when it came, would have a variable it had not previously accounted for. The Night King moved at dawn. Not toward the wall, not yet. The wall remained in his calculus the way a door remains in the calculus of someone who has all the time available and is not yet ready to open it. What moved at dawn was a column of the dead, perhaps 2,000 strong, directed with the specific purposefulness of an intelligence that had decided the anomaly in its domain required closer examination than remote observation through borrowed eyes could provide. They moved through the haunted forest with the silence of things that had no biological need to announce themselves. No breath misting in the cold, no footfall heavier than the snow already present. Just the collective displacement of 2,000 bodies moving in coordinated silence through a landscape that had learned to be afraid of exactly this. Alucard watched them come from a hillside above the tree line with the relaxed posture of a man watching weather approach. Interested, attentive, and entirely untroubled by the scale of what was moving toward him. He had spent the hours since his encounter with the Night King's cold performing a careful inventory of his situation, the kind of honest accounting he rarely bothered with, because the results were usually straightforward. In his own universe, the accounting was simple. He was the most dangerous thing present. Full stop. The end of the calculation. Here, the calculation had acquired variables. The Night King's power over death was jurisdictional. He had established that. It did not extend to him, could not claim the souls he carried, could not incorporate him into the army or direct him with the cold certainty that directed everything else in this landscape. This was good. What was less straightforwardly good was the corollary. The Night King's power over death was jurisdictional, and the jurisdiction was this universe. Every person who died here belonged to him. Every white he raised was a legitimate exercise of a fundamental authority. There was no theft in it, no corruption in the theological sense. This was simply what death looked like in this world, and the Night King was its proper custodian. This complicated the moral arithmetic in ways Alucard found genuinely uncomfortable, which was itself interesting because discomfort was not a sensation he cataloged often. The column reached the base of his hill and stopped. The Night King came through them. He moved the way very powerful things moved when they were not in a hurry, with the complete absence of effort that made effort look like a confession of limitation. He was tall and cold, and carried the specific gravity of something that had been a singular fixed point in this world's cosmology for so long that the world had organized itself around his existence, the way matter organized itself around a massive object. His eyes were the blue of deep ice, the blue of something that had stopped being a color and become a temperature. And they fixed on Alucard with an attention that was not hostile and not welcoming, and not any of the things that eyes normally communicated. They communicated recognition, not the recognition of having met before. They hadn't, not properly. The recognition of one ancient, impossible thing encountering another and understanding immediately, without the preamble that such understanding required between lesser beings. Yeah, exactly what it was looking at. Alucard met his gaze and held it, and the hillside was very quiet. "So," Alucard said, "you do make house calls." The Night King did not speak. This was not, Alucard had decided, because he lacked the capacity, something that had existed for 10,000 years and commanded the complexity of an army this size, had internal sophistication sufficient for language. It was a choice. Speech was for things that needed to explain themselves. Us and the Night King had passed beyond the requirement for explanation so long ago that the habit had simply dissolved. He raised one hand. The 2,000 whites behind him moved, not forward, not in attack formation, but in a slow, deliberate reorganization, spreading laterally across the hillside's base in a pattern that was either tactical containment or demonstration. And the distinction mattered because one of them was a threat and the other was a statement. Alucard read the geometry and decided it was both, which was the most honest answer and also the most interesting one. "You want to show me something?" Alucard said. The Night King lowered his hand, and the white stopped. Then he did something that Alucard had not anticipated and could not have predicted from any prior evidence. He reached into the column of dead behind him and pulled forward a white that had been, in life, a wildling woman. And placed his hand on her face with a gentleness that was absolutely incongruous with everything about the surrounding context. And she changed. Not reanimated. She was already animated. Changed in the way that ice changes when heat is applied and then removed and applied again. Cycling through states, her dead face moving through expressions with the flickering quality of a candle in wind, or the accumulated impression of everything she had been in life moving through the dead architecture of her face like light through a lantern. Then the Night King removed his hand, and she was a white again. Alucard was very still. "You're showing me what you preserve," he said slowly. "That she's still in there. That the death you offer isn't erasure." He looked at the Night King with an expression that had become something he rarely showed. Genuine, unperformed attention, not the face of someone doing serious thinking in real time. "You're making an argument." The Night King looked at him with those ice-blue eyes. "The argument being," Alucard continued, working it out, "that what you're building isn't destruction. It's conservation. A world where nothing is lost because nothing ends. Where death becomes the mechanism of continuity rather than the mechanism of conclusion." He paused. I will be honest with you. That is a more sophisticated philosophical position than I expected from the entity everyone south of your wall characterizes as an existential monster." Another pause. "Not that I'm objecting to being characterized as a monster. I find it accurate and even flattering. But there's a meaningful distinction between a monster and a force of nature, and I'm currently revising which category you belong to." The cold deepened again, but differently. Not the probing cold of the earlier encounter, and not the directed force of a power being applied. This was ambient, the natural cold of something very large simply being fully present, the way a very large animal's warmth fills a room. Then the Night King did something with the whites. He released them, not disbanded, released the way a conductor releases an orchestra at the end of a movement, the specific cessation of active direction that left the musicians present but no longer performing. No 2,000 whites stood on the hillside in the gray dawn light and were simultaneously an army and not an army, present but not directed, maintained but not controlled. And in the gap between controlled and uncontrolled, Alucard felt something he hadn't expected to feel. He felt the souls, faint, compressed, present in the architecture of each dead body the way his own consumed souls were present in his architecture. Not the full person, not the complete consciousness, but the residue of personhood, the impression left by a life in the matter that had contained it. The Night King's whites were not empty. They were occupied by something diminished but present, something that had survived the transition from life to undeath and continued to exist in a reduced and unrecognizable form. The Night King was not harvesting souls. He was storing them. Alucard looked at the 2,000 whites and then at the Night King, and felt the moral arithmetic of his situation rearrange itself entirely around this single piece of information, clicking into a new configuration with the clarity of a very large lock opening. "You're building an ark," Alucard said quietly. The Night King held his gaze. "The long night isn't an ending," Alucard said, the realization arriving with the specific quality of truths that are terrible and important simultaneously. "It's a preservation event. You've been watching this world tear itself apart for 10,000 years, the same cycles, the same wars, the same waste. And you've decided the only way to conserve anything real is to end the cycle entirely. Convert everything to a state that doesn't permit the cycle to continue." He looked at the whites. "The problem," his voice carried something now that was neither approval nor condemnation, but the weight of genuine engagement with a serious argument. "Is that what you preserve? Isn't what they were. You keep the impression. You lose the person. And a world of impressions isn't a world. It's a museum." The Night King looked at him for a long time. Then he turned and walked back through his army toward the deep north, and the 2,000 whites turned with him and followed. And the hillside was empty, except for the gray dawn and the snow, and Alucard standing in it, with the expression of a man who had just had a conversation that was going to require considerable processing time. He stayed on the hillside for a long time after the army disappeared into the forest. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He sat down in the snow and was quiet, not performing quiet, not the theatrical stillness he deployed for effect. Actually, a genuinely quiet. The silence of something that had encountered a question it didn't immediately have an answer to, and was willing to sit with the discomfort of that until an answer arrived. The long night was coming. The Night King was going to convert this world into his museum of preserved impressions. The people south of the wall, with their politics and their wars and their extraordinary commitment to making things worse for each other, were going to be incorporated into an army of the diminished dead, regardless of whether they deserved it, which most of them didn't, or whether they'd earned it, which none of them had, or whether the whole enterprise had any justice to it at all, which it manifestly did not. Alucard was not technically obligated to have an opinion about this. He was a vampire from another universe who had fallen through a hole in reality on what was functionally a Tuesday, and had no institutional investment in the outcome of this world's cosmological conflicts. He sat in the snow and was quiet and thought about a man who had died 6 times in service of an idea and kept coming back because the idea refused to release him. He thought about the fire that had looked at him across a burned mill without hostility. He thought about a painted table in a map room and a queen who had tried to weaponize him and would keep trying because that was what she did. And he found he couldn't generate the contempt for it that he normally would have because it was at least honest, at least a genuine expression of a creature doing exactly what it was built to do. He thought about the Night King's argument, which was genuinely sophisticated and genuinely wrong in a way that genuine sophistication made worse rather than better. And somewhere in the cold, in the quiet, and the gray dawn of a world that wasn't his, Alucard made a decision. Not because he was obligated, not because anyone had earned it, or asked for it correctly, or held his leash. Because 5 centuries of existence had produced, underneath all the performance and the teeth and the theatrical nihilism, something that still recognized the difference between a world that was alive and a world that was a museum. And still, despite its best efforts, cared about the distinction. He stood up. "Well," he said to the empty hillside, brushing snow from his coat with the casual dignity of a man who had just decided something enormous and intended to underplay it completely. "I suppose I'm invested now." He turned south. He came back over the wall at midday, which meant the Night's Watch saw him clearly and had the full benefit of good light in which to be completely unable to process what they were observing. A figure descending the south face of the wall, without equipment, without ropes, without any of the mechanical infrastructure that descent from 700 feet required, moving with the casual verticality of something that had decided gravity was a social convention it was choosing to observe out of politeness rather than necessity. The Lord Commander, a weathered man named Marsh, who had survived 20 years at the wall by being extraordinarily difficult to surprise, watched the descent from the gate tower with an expression of profound professional exhaustion and said nothing until Alucard reached the ground and straightened his coat. "Or you went over," Marsh said. "And back," Alucard agreed. "Which is the part that should interest you professionally." He looked at the old ranger with the directness he reserved for people he decided deserved it. "Your Night King is moving. Not toward the wall yet. He's not ready, or the timing isn't right, or he's still processing something that happened this morning that complicated his schedule. But the army is larger than your intelligence suggests, and the cold is further south than your rangers have reported. Which means either your rangers aren't going far enough, or the ones who went far enough aren't coming back." Marsh looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man performing a rapid assessment of source reliability against information urgency. "How do you know this?" he asked. "I walked through his army this morning," Alucard said. "We had a conversation, non-verbal, but substantive." He paused. "Your wall's magic is real and functional and has been doing its job for 8,000 years. But the mechanism that powers it has been weakening, which you likely know and have been not thinking about because the alternative is too large to practically address. The Night King knows it too. He's patient. He's been patient for 10,000 years. He can afford to wait for the mechanism to fail rather than expend resources forcing it." Another pause. "He can't afford the variable I represent, which is the only reason I'm telling you this instead of simply proceeding independently." "What variable?" Marsh asked. "I'm something his power doesn't apply to," Alucard said simply. "In a war where his fundamental advantage is that everything that dies becomes his asset, I'm an asset that stays subtracted from his column regardless of what happens to me." He looked at the wall. South face now, the face that looked toward the living world, and it had a different quality than the north face, less memory and more hope. The compressed aspiration of everyone who had stood under it and trusted it to hold. I need ravens sent. Multiple ravens, multiple destinations. I'll tell you what to write. Marsh said, "You're not a brother of the Watch." "No," Alucard agreed pleasantly. "I'm something considerably more useful and considerably less manageable. You can spend time on the institutional complications of that, or you can send the ravens. Your choice. But one of those options advances the situation, and the other is just paperwork." The ravens went out before nightfall. The raven that reached Beric Dondarrion found the Brotherhood 3 days' ride south of the Wall, which meant it reached them at roughly the same time that Alucard himself did, having covered the distance with the complete indifference to travel time that moving through shadows across a landscape permitted. He arrived before the raven, actually, and spent an instructive 20 minutes watching Thoros read it with escalating theological disturbance before announcing his presence from behind the fire in a way that caused the Red Priest to produce a sound that was, charitably, unpriestly. "You went north," Thoros said, when he had recovered sufficient composure. "And back," Alucard said, settling into the same position he'd occupied at the mill, across the fire from Beric, with the ease of someone returning to a familiar chair. "The raven is a formality. I wanted to tell you directly." He looked at Beric with the straightforward attention that he'd been reserving for the dead man since their first meeting. "The Night King made me an argument this morning, a genuine one. I want you to hear it, because I think your Lord of Light's perspective on it is something I need to understand before I decide what I'm actually doing here." Beric listened. So Alucard laid out the Night King's argument with the careful precision of someone who had spent several hours in the cold, making sure they understood it correctly before transmitting it. The preservation logic, the arc philosophy, the idea that the long night was not destruction, but conservation of a world that the living had demonstrated they could not be trusted to maintain. He presented it without editorial, and without the ironic distance he normally maintained between himself and serious things, because Beric deserved the argument as it had actually been made rather than the version that was easy to dismiss. When he finished, the fire was lower and the Brotherhood around them was very quiet. "He's wrong," Beric said. "Tell me why," Alucard said. "Not because I disagree. Because I want to hear the specific reason from someone who has been on both sides of the boundary he's managing." Beric looked into the fire for a long time. When he spoke, it had the quality of words that had been waiting a long time for exactly the right question to unlock them. "When Thoros brought me back the first time," he said, "I thought I understood what I'd lost. The fear, the pain, the animal part of being alive that makes you run from things and hold on to people." He paused. "I was wrong. What I'd lost was smaller than I thought and larger than I could measure simultaneously. The fear was gone, yes. But what the Night King preserves," he looked up, "isn't even what I lost. What I lost was the ability to be surprised by something good. What he preserves is less than that. It's just the shape of what someone was, the outline." He shook his head slowly. "An outline isn't a person. It's a proof that a person existed, and a world full of proofs that people existed isn't a world. It's a grave." Alucard was quiet. "That," he said finally, "is the specific reason I was looking for." The fire moved between them, purposeful as it always was when Thoros had been tending it. Mest and Alucard looked at it with an attention that was different from his usual attention to the ruller flame. Not the curiosity of an outsider examining an unfamiliar power, but something closer to the attention of someone who had decided to stop being an outsider. I need to tell you something about what I am, he said, addressing Beric, but aware that the Brotherhood was listening and making the conscious choice to permit it. Not the theatrical version, not the version I used to make Kingsguard reconsider their career choices. He looked at his hands for a moment, gloved, still the hands of something that had stopped having a resting temperature 5 centuries ago. I carry the dead. Everyone I've consumed over 500 years, they're inside me. Not preserved in the Night King's sense, not outlines or impressions. Actually present, actually there. And in a way I don't fully understand and have never fully examined, because examining it requires a degree of honesty about what I am that I find a pause, effortful. The fire was very still. In my world, he continued, I was a weapon, built to be pointed at things and discharged. The person who pointed me was extraordinary enough to make that arrangement one I accepted voluntarily, which is the only arrangement I accept. He looked at Beric. In your world, there is no one who can point me. There is no integra Hellsing. There is no infrastructure built around the specific problem of managing what I am. He paused. There is a dead man who keeps coming back because an idea won't let him go, and a fire that looked at me without hostility, and a wall that has been holding against something for 8,000 years on nothing but intention and material honesty. He looked around at the Brotherhood. The scarred, road-worn, righteously committed faces of people who had chosen a losing fight because it was the right fight. I've been waiting for someone worthy of being my master for 5 centuries. I have been, if I'm being genuinely honest, extremely selective about the criteria. The Brotherhood waited. I'm not going to find that person here, Alucard said. This world doesn't have one. Your queen across the narrow sea has dragons and ambition and genuine conviction. But she wants a weapon she can direct. One, and I don't do directed. He looked at Beric. Your Lord Commander of the Watch is a good man doing an impossible job with insufficient resources and no authority to deploy what I represent. He looked at Cersei's direction, south, and the corner of his mouth moved with something that was not quite contempt and not quite respect. And your Queen Regent understands power, but not the specific kind of power that requires the powerful thing to choose to be used. He looked back at Beric. Which leaves the option I've been avoiding acknowledging, he said, because it's the most structurally unconventional arrangement I've ever considered. And I have 5 centuries of data points on unconventional arrangements. He paused. A dead man sustained by a god whose motives he doesn't fully understand. Fighting a losing battle for people who mostly don't know he's fighting it, without authority or resources, or any realistic expectation of survival. He tilted his head. And that's not a master. That's not a leash. That's something else. I don't have a clean category for it. Neither do I, Beric said. No, Alucard said. But you keep showing up anyway. The fire between them moved. The Night King will come south before the next winter ends, Alucard said, returning to the operational with the ease of someone who had finished saying the difficult thing and was ready to move. When he does, the political situation south of the wall is going to produce exactly the response you'd expect from a continent that has been consuming itself for years. Fragmented, late, and structurally insufficient. He looked at Thoros. Your god brought this man back 6 times for a purpose. I'd like to understand the full scope of that purpose, because I think Araller and I are going to need to have a working relationship, and I prefer to establish the parameters before the crisis rather than during it. Thoros stared at him. You want to negotiate, Thoros said carefully, with the Lord of Light. I want to have a frank professional conversation with the managing intelligence behind the fire that's been sustaining your leader, Alucard said. about the terms under which two very different supernatural powers are going to operate in the same theater of conflict without stepping on each other's jurisdictions. He paused. Is that theologically unprecedented? Thoros opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Yes, he said. Wonderful, Alucard said. I do enjoy precedent setting. The Brotherhood around them exchanged looks, the looks of men who had signed up for righteous banditry in the Riverlands and had arrived, through a series of individually logical steps, at the threshold of something considerably larger. Beric Dondarrion looked at the vampire across the fire with the expression of a man who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting. For something to come along and make the scale of the problem match the scale of the response. We go north? Beric said. Not a question, not a proposal. We go north, Alucard agreed. Outside, the wind had changed direction. It was coming from the north now, and carrying the smell of ice and distance and the particular cold that wasn't weather. The cold that was something much older than weather, moving south with the patience of inevitability. The long night was adjusting its timeline. The long night came on a moonless evening in the third week of the hardest winter anyone south of the wall had seen in living memory, which was either cosmically appropriate or simply the Night King's preference for dramatic staging. And Alucard had spent enough time in the man's cold presence to believe it was probably both. The wall came down not with a sound, but with an absence of one. The 8,000-year conversation between intention and ice simply stopping mid-sentence. The magic that had been load-bearing for longer than most civilizations had existed, ceasing with the completeness of a fire going out. And in the silence that followed, the cold moved south like a door opening. Alucard felt it from 50 miles away. He was with the Brotherhood at a ranging camp north of the last hearth, which had been their forward position for 3 weeks, watching, measuring, sending ravens that received increasingly desperate responses from the south, as the political situation there continued its commitment to being maximally unhelpful at the worst possible time. The responses from King's Landing had stopped 4 days ago. The responses from Castle Black had stopped 2 days ago. The response from Daenerys Targaryen's fleet, somewhere on the narrow sea according to the last intelligence, had never arrived at all, which meant either the ravens hadn't reached her or she had larger problems than correspondence. When the wall came down, Beric looked at Alucard across the ranging camp's fire, and Alucard looked back, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying more clearly. How long? Beric said. Until the vanguard reaches us? Hours? Until the full army is south of the wall? Alucard looked north, where the cold was moving with a new quality, not the ambient cold of 10,000 years of patient waiting, but the purposeful cold of 10,000 years of patient waiting concluding. Less time than anyone south of here has prepared for. They haven't prepared at all, Thoros said, from behind them. The Red Priest had been in constant low prayer for 3 days, tending the fire with the focused desperation of a man who understood and that his god's attention was the most important resource currently available and intended to retain it by any means necessary. His voice had the hoarseness of someone who had been talking to something vast and important for 72 hours without sufficient rest. And his eyes had the specific brightness of a man being sustained by something other than sleep. No, Alucard agreed. They haven't. He looked at the fire. Thoros, your god's been listening for 3 weeks. Has he said anything useful? Thoros was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man translating something that didn't arrive in words. He says the darkness is old, but not permanent. He says the champion of light. If the next words are, has been chosen, and the champion is one of the people we've been corresponding with," Alucard said. "I need you to know that my patience for prophecy is limited, and my preference is for operational specificity." "He says," Thoros continued, with the careful precision of a man delivering a message he doesn't fully understand, "that the fire knows what it's facing, and that what it's facing doesn't know what the fire has found." The campfire moved in a way that had nothing to do with wind. Alucard looked at it for a long moment. "Right," he said. "That's either very cryptic or very straightforward depending on interpretation. And I've decided to interpret it as straightforward because the alternative requires more theology than I have time for." He stood and adjusted his coat with the deliberateness of someone beginning something significant and choosing to begin it correctly. "Beric, what I'm about to do, I need you to understand what it involves before I do it." Beric looked at him steadily. "Tell me." "Level 0, Alucard said, and the words came out with a weight that was not theatrical. The weight of someone naming a thing they had named perhaps 3 times in 5 centuries, and each time with the understanding that the naming changed everything after it. The restriction I maintain on myself, the cage I keep around what I actually am, I built it because the alternative is a force that doesn't distinguish between targets. When I release it, everything I've consumed comes out. Every soul, every body. Mom, the army of the dead I've been carrying inside me since before your wall was built." He looked at Beric with absolute seriousness. "Millions of them. And they will fight because that is what they are. The dead who died in conflict, the warriors and the monsters and the things that fell to me across 5 centuries. They will fight the Night King's army." The Brotherhood was very still. "The problem," Alucard continued, "is that I cannot guarantee their discrimination between the Night King's dead and this world's living. Level 0 is not a precision instrument. It is the opposite of a precision instrument. It is the most powerful thing I can do and the least controllable thing I can do, and I have spent 5 centuries not doing it for exactly that reason." He held Beric's gaze. "I'm telling you this because you are the closest thing I have to a commanding officer in this universe, and then a commanding officer deserves to know what they're authorizing before they authorize it." Beric was quiet for a long time. The wind from the north was very present now, carrying with it the smell of the army, not the smell of bodies. The whites didn't smell of decay the way ordinary dead things did, but the smell of cold and stillness and the specific olfactory signature of living things converted into something that wasn't living anymore. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, Mina moving south through the dark with the patient inevitability of a tide. "Is there another way?" Beric asked. "I can fight without releasing it," Alucard said. "I can do considerable damage at my normal operating capacity. I can regenerate from anything the Night King's army can produce, and I can kill whites faster than most things currently alive on this continent." He paused. "But the Night King's army is larger than what I can address at normal capacity before it reaches the populations further south. And I can't kill the Night King himself. Not with certainty. Not without understanding whether his death ends the army or simply decentralizes it. And the intelligence on that question is incomplete." "What does killing the Night King do?" Beric asked. "In theory, breaks the connection between him and the whites. Drops them." Alucard's eyes moved to the north, on tracking something that wasn't visible yet, but was close enough to track. "In practice, the mechanism of the Night King's power is native to this universe, and I am not. I can disrupt it. I can engage it directly. But the Night King is not a white. He is not a raised dead. He is something older and fundamentally different, and the specific thing that ends him, if anything ends him, may need to come from this universe's own resources rather than mine. The fire flared. Thoros looked at it with the sudden sharp attention of a man receiving information. The Lord of Light says... He stopped. Started again. He says the prince that was promised is in the south, and that the sword of the morning needs to be lit before the sun rises. Poetic, Alucard said. Operationally vague. Noted. He looked at Beric. I need a decision. Beric Dondarrion stood in the northern wind and looked at the vampire who had fallen through a hole in reality, and stayed because things were interesting, and then stayed further because something had caught him that wasn't a leash, and wasn't a master, and wasn't anything he had a clean category for. He looked at the fire. He looked at the dark north where the army of the dead was moving through the trees with the sound of nothing, which was louder than any sound. Can hold level 0, Beric said. Until there's no other option. Until we know whether the South has anything that can reach the Night King directly. He held Alucard's gaze. You said his death needs to come from this universe's resources. Find out if those resources exist before we use the last resort. And if they don't exist? Alucard asked. Then we find out together, Beric said simply. Alucard looked at him for a moment, with the expression he reserved for things that had moved him without his permission. The rare, uncomfortable, genuine expression of something 500 years old encountering a form of courage it hadn't fully cataloged before. A man who had died 6 times, choosing not to authorize the weapon that might save everyone, because the weapon might also destroy what it was saving, and the specific moral precision of someone who had been to the other side of death enough times to understand exactly what was worth protecting about the living. Right, Alucard said quietly. Then we hold the line. The vanguard hit them 20 minutes later, 300 whites moving through the trees, with the silent coordination of things sharing a single directing intelligence. And they hit a line consisting of 20 Brotherhood fighters, 1 repeatedly dead nobleman with a flaming sword, 1 red priest maintaining a fire that burned with more than wood, and 1 vampire operating at full capacity with every restriction intact and every consumed soul held carefully in reserve. The vanguard did not fare well. Alucard moved through them with the efficiency of something that had been doing this for 5 centuries and found the scale insulting. Not because he wanted more of a challenge, exactly, but because 300 whites represented the Night King's assessment of what was required to handle the ranging camp's occupants, which meant the Night King had not yet updated his estimate to account for the variable. This was information. He moved through the vanguard like weather moves through a wheat field. Not selective, not strategic, simply present and then past, while leaving behind the structural collapse of things that had encountered something their architecture wasn't built to survive. Beric's flaming sword cut through the whites with Roller's fire, doing something to the cold that animated them. Not merely destroying the bodies, but addressing the animation itself. The fire finding the seam between dead matter and the Night King's direction, and burning along it. The Brotherhood fought with the specific courage of people who had chosen to be here and understood what being here cost. And the fire Thoros tended roared higher than fuel should have permitted. The vanguard was gone in 11 minutes. In the silence after, with the bodies of 300 whites lying in the snow around them, Alucard stood at the camp's northern edge and looked into the forest where the dark was deeper than dark should be, and felt the Night King's attention like a hand pressed flat against the world's surface, feeling for what had just happened, processing the new data. The army behind the vanguard numbered somewhere between 80 and 100,000. It began to move. Beric, Alucard said without turning. I know, Beric said behind him. The South needs to produce something, Alucard said. I can hold here for a while. I can make this expensive. But a while is not forever, and expensive is not sufficient. He felt the army moving, the cold of it, the scale of it, the vast, patient machinery of the Night King's 10,000-year project, finally in motion. Someone needs to find the thing that ends him. The fire behind them burned with the color of purpose. In the deep south, on the narrow sea, 3 dragons caught a thermal and turned north. The battle lasted 3 days. Not continuously, not in the sense of unbroken engagement from the first vanguard to the final moment. Because wars of this scale didn't operate with that kind of narrative tidiness. And the Night King was not a general who needed to commit his full force when patience served the same function at lower cost. What it lasted was 3 days of the Night King's army pressing south in waves. Each wave calibrated with the cold intelligence of something that had been studying warfare for 10,000 years, and had the additional advantage of not caring how many of its soldiers it expended, because every soldier it expended could theoretically be reclaimed from whoever killed them. This last assumption required revision on the first day. Alucard's kills did not rise. This was the variable the Night King had not adequately modeled. Not merely that the vampire was difficult to kill, or not merely that his conventional combat capacity was substantial, but that every white Alucard destroyed was destroyed in a manner that did not permit reclamation. The souls he carried, the millions of consumed dead pressing against the interior of his restriction, created a kind of jurisdictional gravity around his kills. The Night King's claim on newly dead things in his proximity was contested by the presence of so much death that answered to a different authority. The whites he destroyed stayed destroyed. The ground around him was, from the Night King's perspective, a dead zone in the most operationally inconvenient sense. Territory where his asset recovery model simply did not function. By the end of the first day, the Night King understood the shape of the problem. By the end of the second day, he had restructured his approach around it, directing his army to bypass Alucard's position where possible, to flow around the dead zone the way water flows around a stone, to advance on multiple fronts simultaneously and force the variable to choose which front to address. This was sophisticated. This was the intelligence of something that had been general and king and force of nature simultaneously for longer than most civilizations had existed. And Alucard met it with genuine respect and genuine violence in roughly equal measure, moving between fronts with the shadow transit speed that made distance a negotiable concept, leaving destruction in his wake that the Night King's army couldn't recover and couldn't ignore. The Brotherhood held the northern position with the specific tenacity of people who had decided to die well and kept being denied the opportunity. Beric's flaming sword was doing something that Thoros's increasingly frantic communion with Rahalor was amplifying. The fire-finding in the chaos of the battle, a quality it hadn't possessed in smaller conflicts, burning with an intentionality that addressed the Night King's animation directly. Each white Beric destroyed stayed destroyed with a completeness that had a theological signature. Ruller's fire writing something in the act of destruction that the Night King's cold couldn't revise. The Lord of Light, it appeared, had been waiting for exactly this theater to demonstrate what his fire was actually for. Thoros stopped sleeping entirely on the second day, and no one suggested he start again. The turning point arrived not from the north, where Alucard was doing things to the Night King's army that would require considerable documentation to adequately describe, but from the south and above. The sound of dragons arriving at altitude with the specific acoustic signature of things that were very large and very fast and very much on fire. Daenerys Targaryen had received the raven. Daenerys Targaryen had come north. Alucard, in the middle of the Second Front's engagement, heard the dragons and felt something he recognized as relief. which was an unusual sensation and one he chose not to examine too carefully because the current operational tempo didn't support introspection. Dragonfire was not ordinary fire. He had known this theoretically. The intelligence he'd gathered over 3 weeks of preparation had made clear that Valyrian fire was categorically different from the fire of wood and want, that it operated by rules which were native to this world's deepest magical architecture, and had a specific relationship with the Night King's cold that other fire didn't possess. What he hadn't known was the scale of the difference until he felt it. The dragonfire hitting the Night King's army from above, and not merely burning the whites, but addressing their animation with the authority of something that belonged to this universe's fundamental layer, the layer where the Night King's power lived. The whites caught by dragonfire did not rise. Daenerys flew her largest dragon in patterns that suggested someone had briefed her on the Night King's army distribution, which meant the ravens had reached her with sufficient operational detail, which meant someone at Castle Black had been doing their job in the chaos. Alucard made a mental note to find out who and express something in the vicinity of professional appreciation. The army's cohesion fractured under the aerial assault, not broke, not routed, because the Night King's dead didn't root and didn't fracture in the way living armies did. But the directing intelligence had to redistribute its attention across too many simultaneous problems, and the redistribution created gaps. Alucard went through the gaps. He found the Night King on the 3rd day, at dawn, in a clearing north of the last hearth, where the cold was absolute and the snow had stopped falling, because even the weather had decided to stay out of this particular conversation. The Night King stood in the clearing with the stillness of something that had known this moment was coming, and had chosen to meet it directly rather than continue the indirect engagement. And around him, the remnants of his advance army were arranged in the formation of a final guard. Not thousands anymore. The 3 days had been expensive, even for something that could theoretically reclaim its losses. But hundreds, the dead standing in concentric rings around their maker, with the silent loyalty of things that had no choice, but also, somehow, no desire for one. Alucard walked through them. Not fought through, walked through, the shadows carrying him past the reaching dead hands, and the blue eyes, and the cold. The restriction holding at every step because Beric had told him to hold it, and he had told Beric he would, and he discovered, walking through the Night King's final guard, that this particular commitment had more structural weight than he'd anticipated when he made it. The dead hands passed through him where he permitted it, and met resistance where he didn't, and he emerged into the clearing's center with his coat intact and his restriction intact, and the Night King 6 feet away, looking at him with those ice-blue eyes that communicated recognition, and something older than recognition. They stood in the clearing, and the dawn was very cold and very quiet. I want you to know," Alucard said, "that I understand the argument. I spent 3 days thinking about it while I was dismantling your army, which is the kind of productive multitasking that only becomes possible after the first few centuries." He looked at the Night King with the full, unperformed attention that he reserved for things he genuinely respected. "The world is wasteful. The living are catastrophically bad at being alive. The cycle of violence and stupidity and squandered potential that constitutes human civilization is, from a certain angle, from a very cold and very patient angle, genuinely enough to make your solution look like mercy." He paused. "You're not wrong about the problem." The Night King held his gaze. "You're wrong about the solution," Alucard said. "Not because preservation is worse than destruction, it's not, arguably, but because the thing you'd preserve isn't the thing worth preserving. You'd keep the impression and lose the capacity. You'd keep the memory of what a person was and eliminate the possibility of what a person might become." His voice had the weight of someone who had spent 5 centuries consuming people and carrying them and arriving, through that long accumulation, at an understanding of what people actually were that most people never reached. And the possibility is the only part that matters. The past is a record. The future is the argument. Or you'd win the record and forfeit the argument. Something moved in the Night King's expression. Not a change exactly. More like a depth becoming briefly visible, the way very deep water sometimes shows its depth when the light hits it correctly. He raised his hand. The cold came, not the probing cold of the haunted forest encounter, not the directed cold of the hillside meeting, but the full cold of something that had held back for 10,000 years and was no longer holding back. The cold of a force expressing itself completely for the first time in a very long span of patient waiting. It hit Alucard with the weight of geological time and cosmic certainty and the absolute conviction of something that knew it was the conclusion. The restriction held. For 3 seconds it held by will alone. Alucard's will, by 5 centuries of accumulated experience and choice, and the specific decision he'd made in the snow on a hillside in the north when he'd decided that a world alive was worth more than a world preserved. 3 seconds of the most serious effort he had expended in longer than he could accurately calculate. Holding the cage closed against a force that was reaching through it for the millions of dead inside and finding them, and beginning, with terrible patience, to make its jurisdictional argument. And then Beric was there. He had come through the clearing's edge with the flaming sword burning at its fullest. Ruller's fire at the complete expression of whatever the Lord of Light had been building toward across 6 deaths and a long road and a conversation by a fire in a burned mill. And the fire hit the Night King's cold at the precise moment that the cold had Alucard's full attention, and the collision of the 2 ancient forces produced something that the clearing's air could barely contain. Light and cold, and the competing claims of 2 cosmic principles on the fundamental question of what death was for. The Night King turned, and from above, through the clearing's open sky, dragonfire fell. The Night King did not burn easily. He was not a white, was not animated dead, was not subject to the simple calculus that ended his soldiers. He was older than the dragons, older than the Targaryens, older than the dynasty that had bred the creatures now delivering his conclusion from above. But the dragonfire found, in the Night King's cold, the specific seam that Beric's R'hllor fire had been burning along for 3 days and widened it with the authority of something that was native to this world's deepest layer, and the cold that had been absolute and patient and permanent for 10,000 years. Fractured. The sound it made was not a sound, and it was the absence of the sound that cold made. The silence of a temperature that had been a fixed constant of the world's experience, suddenly and completely not being there. And in the silence, the whites dropped, all of them, simultaneously, across every front of a 3-day battle. The hundreds in the clearing, and the thousands further north, and the vanguards, and the flanking forces, and every repurposed dead body that had been walking south on the Night King's instruction. All of them, at once, simply stopping. The clearing was very quiet. Beric lowered his sword. Alucard stood in the sudden absence of 10,000 years of cold, and felt the world's temperature normalizing around him, and felt the millions of dead inside him settling, the pressure of the restriction easing, the army he carried understanding that the thing that had reached for them was gone. He looked at where the Night King had been. The ice and the cold and the ancient presence were gone, with the completeness of something that had never been permanent, only patient. A conclusion that had been approaching for 10,000 years and had finally arrived at its own ending rather than the world's. Beric stood in the clearing with the flaming sword burning lower now, the purpose that had sustained it for so long beginning to ease with the crisis that had required it. And his face had an expression that was not relief exactly and not grief exactly. but the expression of someone standing at the end of something enormous, finding that the end looked different from the inside than it had looked from a distance. "Still alive," Alucard observed. "Apparently," Beric said. "How do you feel?" Beric considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Different," he said finally. "Like something that was holding me here has..." He paused, finding the word, loosened. Alucard looked at him for a long moment. "Ruller got what he needed from you," he said quietly. "What happens next is yours." Beric looked at the sky. The dawn sky of a world that had just survived its own conclusion, gray and cold and extraordinarily ordinary. In the way that skies become extraordinary when you've been uncertain whether you'd see them again. The dragons circled above in the distance, reducing altitude. The battle that had required them no longer requiring them. "Or what about you?" Beric asked. Alucard looked north, where the cold was already retreating, not the Night King's cold that was gone, but the ordinary cold of an ordinary winter. The cold that belonged to the world, rather than to any ancient force with a philosophical position. He looked at the painted table in his memory, the map of a continent he hadn't known existed 3 months ago, and he looked at all the interesting things that were still in motion. A queen with dragons and ambition who had just participated in ending the long night and would need to decide what came next. A political landscape south of the wall that had been running on the assumption of the Night King's eventual arrival and would need to recalibrate to the reality of his absence. All the ordinary human chaos that had been temporarily suspended by the weight of an existential threat and would now resume with the specific energy of people who had nearly been annihilated and were processing that near miss through the medium of politics. "The interesting situation," he said, "has not concluded." Beric looked at him with something that had completed its evolution from the ghost of a smile into an actual one. The real thing, unearned across 3 days and 3 deaths and one very long conversation about the philosophy of death. "No," he agreed. "It hasn't." Above them, the dawn came fully over a world that had survived its own ending, cold and clear and full of the ordinary, extraordinary difficulty of everything that came after. The Night King was gone, but Westeros remained. And Westeros, as Alucard had observed from his first night in the Red Keep's dungeons, was a continent with an extraordinary commitment to making things difficult for itself. The long night had not unified the living. It had simply paused their disagreements, and pauses, in Alucard's considerable experience, were not resolutions. Cersei still sat her throne with the specific tenacity of a woman who treated survival as a personal achievement. Daenerys still had dragons, and the kind of conviction that made dragons seem like the smaller part of the equation. And then somewhere in all of it, the Brotherhood without banners rode the Riverlands roads with a dead man at their head who was, for the first time in 6 deaths, beginning to feel the loosening of what had held him. Alucard did not leave. This surprised him more than anyone. He had no master here, no leash, no institutional framework for what he was. What he had was a world that had earned his attention, not through power, not through the ability to contain or direct him, but through the rarer quality of being genuinely, stubbornly worth saving despite its comprehensive efforts to prove otherwise. He moved through Westeros like weather, present, consequential, ungovernable. And the great game continued around him with the adjustment that all its players had made, consciously or not, to the knowledge that something unkillable was watching. It was, he decided, enough. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, a beginning of something that had no clean category, which was, in his experience, always where the actually interesting things lived.